Stanford University.
Welcome to our second lecture on the topic of the Deepwater Horizon disaster and the future of drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. I'm Pam Matson, the Dean of the School of Earth Sciences, and I think some of you were probably here 2 weeks ago when we had our first talk, and thanks for coming again. 2 weeks ago, Professor Roland Horn began the discussion about the events of April 20th. I think probably everyone in this room knows that on April 20th, an explosion on the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig in the Gulf of Mexico killed 11 workers and injured 17 others. And the subsequent fire burned for about 36 hours, sinking the rig. And it's estimated that 4.9 million barrels, or about 185 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Gulf. The wellhead was capped on July 15th. And finally, on September 19th, the federal government declared the well effectively dead. But of course, the conversation and the debate about it has raged on ever since. Now, in the first lecture, Professor Horn talked about what went wrong technically and why. And for those of you who are interested who did not see that, that is now available on our website, the School of Earth Sciences, earthsci.stanford.edu, and also on Stanford iTunes. But tonight, our speakers are going to be looking not so much at the past, but at the future. And we'll talk about the continuing need for energy resources that ultimately drives oil exploration in places like the Gulf, and on the regulatory reform necessary to ensure that we don't have accidents like the one in the Gulf. So Mark Zoback is our first speaker, and he's going to talk about drilling in the Gulf in the larger context of energy demand and energy resources. Mark is the Benjamin Page Professor in the Department of Geophysics in the School of Earth Sciences. He's an expert in reservoir geomechanics. He is a member of the National Academy's committee that is charged with analyzing the causes of the Deepwater Horizon explosion, fire, and oil spill in order to identify measures that are needed to prevent similar accidents from happening in the future. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, Mark was in Washington involved in the release of their interim report for that committee. He has received the Walter Bucher Medal from the American Geophysical Union, the New Zealand Geophysics Prize, and the Emil Weichert Medal from the German Geophysical Society. He's an honorary fellow of the European Geosciences Union, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Geophysical Union, and the Geological Society of America. At Stanford, Mark has chaired the Department of Geophysics. He was also the chair of the university's faculty senate, which is a really challenging position. And he received the Kenneth Cuthbertson Award for exceptional contributions to the university. Before coming to Stanford in 1984, he was a geophysicist and a science leader at the US Geological Survey. So Mark's going to speak first, and then Meg Caldwell will speak next, and she will talk about the unique environment of the Gulf of Mexico and the challenges inherent in creating a regulatory process that works in that kind of place. Meg is a law professor. She directs the Environmental and Natural Resources Law and Policy program at the Stanford Law School. And in addition to that faculty position, she's a fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment, and she serves as the executive director for the Center for Ocean Solutions. The Center for Ocean Solutions is a collaboration between Stanford, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And its mission is to bring together the natural, physical, and social sciences to help solve problems of the ocean. Meg's a widely acknowledged and well-respected figure in environmental law. She was selected as the chair of the California Coastal Commission and served in that position for 3 years or so. She has also served on the board of the California Coastal Conservancy, and she was appointed by the California Secretary of Natural Resources to the Marine Life Protection Act Blue Ribbon Task Force, and basically has worked on coastal issues across California. Before joining the Stanford Law School faculty in 1994, she served as an associate in the environmental law group of McCutcheon, Doyle, Brown, and Enerson. So the lectures tonight and the one 2 weeks ago are co-sponsored by the School of Earth Sciences, the Center for Ocean Solutions, the Woods Institute for the Environment, and the Precourt Institute for Energy. All Stanford organizations, but I think this combination of hosts really illustrates the many different disciplines and many different players that have something to say and something to contribute to the complicated set of issues and challenges that are displayed in this example from the Gulf. So tonight's lectures, as well as the lecture a couple of weeks ago, will be available again on the School of Earth Sciences website, as well as the Stanford YouTube in a few weeks. Now, one last thing before we get started, I want to acknowledge the funding for these lectures from the A.J. Horn Lectureship on U.S. Energy Consumption and the Harold W. Hoots Visiting Lectureship in Earth Sciences. And we're very grateful to these generous endowments for allowing us to do things like tonight's event. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Mark Zoback. After Mark, Meg Caldwell will speak. And then at the end of her comments, all three of our speakers, our lecturers, will come up and join in a panel discussion and a question and answer. So Mark, thank you.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you all for coming and your continued interest in this important event. What I'd like to do today is sort of build a bridge between Roland's presentation from last week about the accident and the kinds of comments Meg is going to make about regulatory reform. And as Pam said, our committee's interim report was released 2 weeks ago. And in that report, we cite over a dozen significant factors and decisions that contributed in a very significant way to the loss of well control, the blowout, and the subsequent oil spill. Now, Roland went through this very comprehensively on November 16th, and I'm not going to do it again, but the issues of proceeding to temporary abandonment, even though it was very clear that there had not been a cement barrier sealing the hydrocarbons. The delay in recognizing that flow was coming into the well, and once it was recognized, the inability to take timely and aggressive action, the inability of the blowout preventer, either by design or by malfunction, to actually control the flow once it happened. Backing up even further, decisions about how the casing would be put in the well and the cementing done and the type of cement that was used and the volume and so on. They're just a long, long list, and Roland went through it very effectively. So I'm not going to talk about that tonight, but I do want to talk about some other things. And one of the issues that establishes a bridge between what happened and what we do in the future is the issue of management and regulatory oversight. Excuse me. And in our report, one thing we emphasized was that none of these factors or decisions were identified or corrected either by the operating management of BP, the company in charge, or their principal contractors, mostly it was Halliburton and their subsidiaries, or the other companies involved. So the people who carrying out the project were missing all of these issues, as was the regulatory system, what was the Minerals Management Survey, and it's now been renamed as BOEM. But basically, the regulatory system failed to do its job as well. And this dual combination of factors, of course, is what allowed the accident to happen. Now, if you've been conscious for the last 25 years or so, you're aware of the fact that the issues surrounding energy supply, energy in the environment, energy security are sort of the issues that define our times. And this very nice slide, which I borrowed from Professor Sally Benson, makes that case very nicely. World population is expected to stabilize at around 9.5 billion people by mid-century. But by mid-century, we're going to need twice as much energy as we have today. By the end of this century, the estimates are that we're going to need 3 to 4 times as much energy as we have today. And we have to provide that energy while not damaging the environment more than we've already damaged it. And it has to be secure, and it has to be economic, and so on and so forth. Now, this is a slide from the book of Professor Steve Garelick, another of our colleagues. And it shows very nicely that there's a linear relationship between the amount of oil that's used and the income per capita, GDP of countries. The more wealthy you are, the more energy you use. And there's different ways of portraying this. In this case, it's portrayed in the amount of oil that's used, and the different countries are labeled there. Now, this is a pretty compelling diagram, but of course, what is impossible not to notice is Brazil, India, and China down in the corner of the plot, and we know which way they're moving. They're getting wealthier very fast, and as they move to the right on the wealth curve, they're going to move up on the oil consumption curve. Now, maybe they'll be not quite on the same slope, but nonetheless, as these major countries develop, their demand for energy is going to increase quite dramatically. And that's the sobering challenge. Now, Steve also points out in his book that there's some very good news, too, and that is we are getting more efficient. And this shows the oil use intensity sort of per dollar as a function of time. And over the last 50 to 60 years, globally, we've become about 38% more efficient. In the US, in the last, since 1975, so the last 35 years or so, we've improved by 54%, and China in the last 30 years or so has improved by 63%. So efficiency is extremely important and is a moderating factor, but nonetheless, even incorporating that, we are going to need this increase of energy in the future to satisfy global demand. Now, if we turn our attention to the US, we all kind of know the main story, that consumption has gone up for the last 50 or 60 years. But production peaked in the 1970s and has been steadily going down. And today, we are, in fact, importing 60% of the oil we use. And that's a fact. I heard an interesting story told that from an elderly gentleman you all know. He pointed out he was a young person in the Eisenhower administration, and President Eisenhower got very concerned when the US started to import 10% of its oil. This is not a new issue, but it's one that we've not been able to address. Now, the reason for bringing this up in terms of the Deepwater Horizon and the Gulf of Mexico is something that many of you might not know about, and that is there have been a series of extremely large discoveries of oil in very deep water and at very great depth. And this is sometimes referred to as the Paleogene play, referring to the age of the geologic formations from which the oil is being produced. And they're shown by these green dots out here. And all of the major oil companies have made these discoveries. At the time, this is from a paper that was published a couple years ago. And at this time, there had been around 13 to 16 discoveries, about a 70% success rate. And more wells are being drilled, and these discoveries are being confirmed, and the resource is being evaluated as further exploration is occurring. Now, the estimates are still very uncertain, but the estimates are somewhere between 3 to 15 billion barrels of recoverable oil, just from these new discoveries alone. Now, we're importing about 12 billion barrels a day. From that previous chart, you could see that if you were reading the axes. And so if you were to take 9 billion as sort of a mid-range number, this amount of oil would reduce imports by 25% for a decade. And so, it's a very significant resource. And it's going to be challenging. The reservoirs are very deep. Deep water and deep rock. Now, if you think about these resources then, it's important to recognize, and I think Roland showed these data, that the Gulf of Mexico is now accounting for 30% of all US oil production, which is a significant increase in just the last couple of years. 80% of Gulf of Mexico oil is due to deep water fields. 1/4 of US oil production comes from deep water, and globally, deep water production has tripled in the last decade. This is where the action is. This is where the resource is, both in the United States and around the world. Now, why do we need this oil? Why do we need to produce it? What are our alternatives? Now, looking to the future, this is the official prediction of the Department of Energy's Energy Information Agency. This is the Energy Outlook 2010. And what you can see going 25 years into the future is we're still using a lot of coal, nuclear's moving along, natural gas, liquids, this is oil, it's moving along. And then we see the effect of biofuels and the increased fraction of our energy picture coming from renewables. In other words, if you kind of compare their vision of 2035 with 2008, it's pretty much business as usual for fossil fuels, with the combined effects of efficiency and renewables taking up what we need for additional energy resources. So for the foreseeable future, we need to supply large volumes of fossil fuels just to sort of sustain where we are, even in the context of making major investments in renewables and trying to advance renewables and non-carbon fuels as much as possible. So I'd like to qualify the fact that I am not a paid spokesman for the Houston Chamber of Commerce when I talk about this. But when you look at the numbers and realize where energy has to come from, it is undeniable that we are going to continue to need large volumes of natural oil, of oil and natural gas for the foreseeable future. But the end of oil is being widely discussed, and those of us who were around in the 1970s, or at least remember the 1970s, remember Sheikh Yamani, who in 2003 was quoted in this Economist article, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." And I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I think everyone knows that there's a penalty we pay, and the penalty is climate change, and the accumulation of greenhouse gas, and the predictions of warming based on those accumulations are really undeniable, and we can't simply use every bit of fossil fuel that's left without recognizing that that is a path to an inevitably warmer world and a very different world than the one we live in. And there are many contexts in which this problem is discussed, and many solutions for stabilizing emissions by using a combination of solutions. This is a very nice paper that talks about practical methods for reducing emissions using available technologies today. So we have to do all we can to move away from the methods of the past. And in fact, my personal research right now is largely dedicated on this wedge right here, natural gas, and trying to expand the utilization of natural gas, largely at the expense of coal to produce electricity. And in fact, it even can be used as a transportation fuel. The reasons for this is that it's been recognized in just the past few years that there are extraordinarily extensive amounts of natural gas available from organic rich shales around the world. And what's been known for a long time is that natural gas is a far cleaner fossil fuel. So it's not a clean fuel, but in fact, with respect to CO2, for example, it produces about half as much CO2 as coal when you're making electricity, and it's far cleaner in many other ways as well. So, you know, it's not a business as usual scenario that I'm talking about, but the oil production in the Gulf of Mexico is quite important. So let me come back to the report just briefly, and as a kind of introduction to Meg's presentation. As Pam said, the committee was convened to do two things. One was to report on the causes of the accident, and we've done so, and that report is available, and Roland basically hit all the major points 2 weeks ago, and hopefully many of you heard his presentation. But I think our remaining task is even more challenging, and that is to make recommendations that prevent such accidents from occurring in the future. So our next steps are to consider the impacts of government and private sector initiatives. You know, every week or two, something new is in the paper that's happened. The major oil companies have formed a private nonprofit corporation, the Well Containment Corporation. They've thrown $1 billion into generating facilities that will be able to respond quickly if there is another significant accident. At the same time, the BOEM, the agency that's replaced MMS, has been issuing, you know, new requirements that should be making drilling safer. But we on the committee don't really think that's going to get us there, quite frankly. And the next order of business, which we'll probably just be starting right after the holidays, is to take a really hard look at other regulatory environments around the world. For example, those that are used in Norway, UK, Canada, et cetera. And it's a very different approach. It's an approach which is called the safety case approach. And with a safety case approach, rather than have a whole bunch of requirements and somebody sitting in an office just sort of checking the boxes, in a safety case approach, what you're doing is you're really laying out a project in a comprehensive way and then considering all of the risks, laying out in detail how those risks are going to be managed. And when something new or unexpected occurs, you're propagating a change in the plan through the entire plan in order to see what the consequences of any change in operations might be. It's a very comprehensive approach. In fact, companies like Shell and Exxon are already using it in the United States, even though they're not required to. They're doing it for their own purposes, which is kind of interesting. They are voluntarily going beyond what the government requires. The challenge is if our committee, and this is completely hypothetical, but if our committee were to recommend such an approach for drilling in US waters, the companies would adapt to it very easily because they're already working with this system in the North Sea, for example. The hard part is whether the government would be able to live up to its part and regulate within that system. So it's going to be a real challenge, and it'll be interesting to see where things go. And I think whatever happens, there's got to be much closer cooperation between industry and government for these kinds of challenging wells to be drilled safely in the future. So I think the one thing we all agree about who've looked at this problem is that deep water drilling can be done safely. In the last 10 years, 2,000 wells have been drilled in over 1,000 feet of water, with the single accident, the Deepwater Horizon, being the singular exception to an otherwise admirable safety record. But you don't have to look at this very hard to see that the current operational and regulatory standards are not adequate, and we want to fix the problem before the projects that are being undertaken are even more challenging than the ones that are, that have occurred in the past. So it's, even in the wake of this terrible disaster, it's largely a good news story. We know we can do this. We know it can be done safely. We just have to organize ourselves around what we know and what we've learned in order for this to proceed. And one thing we can all agree about is that we never want to see this kind of thing to happen again. So I'll just stop right there. Thank you very much.
So Mark really did provide the perfect setup for me, and I just want to start by explaining that it wasn't my goal in life to be an expert in offshore oil and gas regulatory reform, but as I was sitting up on the North Coast, not far from Eureka, working on the Marine Life Protection Act and trying to help decide where the marine protected areas should be for that section of California's coast, I got a call from Senator Boxer's office saying that she was going to be calling a hearing in about 2 weeks' time, and she was interested in having me come back to provide some testimony on the BP oil spill. And this was in May, so things were just getting into full swing. I worked for about 2 hours texting and leaving voice messages, trying to find someone else to do that. And there were many people that could have done it. And finally, I realized that she really wanted someone from California, and she really wanted someone from a leading university. And I wasn't going to be able to say no to that. And so that started this path for me in working on the BP oil disaster, and subsequently testifying before the Presidential Commission on the BP oil spill, and supplying extensive written testimony dealing with this topic of regulatory reform and how we can do a better job. So I'm just going to give you some highlights tonight, and just say that if you're interested in diving deeper, there's a great deal of material that's available through the BP Oil Commission website, and I'd be happy to supply you with the really lengthy comments that I've been able to put together, and many of my colleagues have done a really admirable job in investigating other aspects of this situation. So I'm going to just start really briefly and review. There are just some common statistics here, and I thought it was really interesting. With 4.9 million barrels of oil probably spilled, going to Mark's number for the amount of oil that we actually import, with 12 million barrels imported per day, we're talking about a relatively small amount of the total amount of oil that we're handling here in the United States. So that's rather interesting. And yet, this one, of course, had really significant impacts, some of which are obvious, but many of which are not so obvious, and some of which we will only know as time passes. I think it's also important to put this into context globally. And if we look at the major oil spills that we've seen, at least have been able to record in terms of their size, the BP oil spill would be the second largest recorded, second only to the Gulf War oil spill, which of course was an intentional release of oil by Saddam Hussein. And you'll notice that the Exxon Valdez spill isn't even on the chart. It was 19 times smaller than the BP Deepwater Horizon spill. And yet 20 years later, some 20 years later, we are still finding oil contamination in the sediments up in Prince William Sound. We've still found that a couple of pods of orcas haven't recovered. We still have a major Pacific herring fishery that has not recovered. So I think it's important to understand that even though the Exxon Valdez was much, much smaller on a scale, that the potential impacts of a spill of this size can be quite substantial. And the other point that I'd like to make is one that my colleague Larry Crowder made to me about a month ago, and that is that there are some really serious chronic oil spills that also don't manage to make it onto charts like this. The Niger River Delta, for example, experiences the equivalent of an Exxon Valdez spill every year, and that's just chronic releases in the Niger River Delta, which have profound effects for that side of Western Africa. So now I just want to share with you some of the things that are really special about the Gulf from my standpoint. And this is by no means an exhaustive account of what makes the Gulf special, but it's really got very unique topography and bathymetry. You can see the outer continental shelf is quite large. We have about 38% of the Gulf area that is covered by relatively shallow and intertidal areas, another 22% or so that extends out to on the outer continental shelf. So when we talk about an environment like this, a coupled geophysical environment, it's really dominated by the benthic environment, by the sea floor. And many of the species that inhabit the Gulf are really dependent on the benthic environment and the health of that environment, the seafloor environment, and are either feeding off of that environment or spending some significant time of their life history in contact with that environment. So the shrimp and the crabs, for example, that are predated on by the higher trophic levels are naturally spending a fair amount of time in that area. The other feature that you've probably already grown to hear about or have heard about quite a bit is that it's dominated by this loop current system that comes up from the Yucatan Peninsula, parallels the Texas coast, and then it loops around and goes through the Florida Straits and ultimately becomes the Gulf Stream that bathes the Atlantic seaboard. And the loop current was of particular concern with the Deepwater Horizon spill because folks who knew about the existence of this feature were very concerned that the oil would be entrained in the loop current. Now, the loop current is super important for a lot of the species that inhabit the Gulf. Many of the species that are actually born in the Gulf of Mexico in their larval stages manage to get entrained into the loop current and then are brought out into the oceanic environment where they will live out their juvenile and adult stages, and some of which will come back into the Gulf, of course, and breed there again and continue that cycle. There's a special form of sea algae called sargassum that actually starts and grows in the Gulf, and then small hatchling turtles will attach themselves and find protection in the sargassum, and then it connects up with the loop current, and those sea turtles find their way out to the Atlantic, for example. And of course, there are many endangered species that use this territory as well. On the far right, we have the sperm whale, and the sperm whales are really fascinating mammal. It uses the entire column vertical column of the Gulf area, and the records of how deeply that animal can dive are really quite astounding. So in the course of any given day, it is going up and down to the deepest depths of the Gulf and feeding and doing other important things for a sperm whale. The Kemp's Ridley sea turtle in the middle is the most endangered sea turtle. It of course spends important stages of its life history also in the Gulf, where it's nesting and hatchlings are released, and then, as I mentioned, hitching a ride with some of that sargassum to go out to the Atlantic. And the manatees, too, are endangered species that inhabit the Gulf. They actually were just going to their feeding grounds about the time of the, along the Louisiana coast about the time that the Macondo well blew. Now, bluefin tuna are one of our favorite here at Stanford because we happen to have one of the world's experts on bluefin tuna at Hopkins Marine Station, and that's Professor Barb Block. This is the track of an 800-pound bluefin tuna that started this particular journey after it was tagged by Barb Block up in the Canadian area and came down the Atlantic seaboard and then entered the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see that it has, there's seasonality to where it's spending its time, and it's going into the Gulf just in the region of the oil spill to breed and spawn. And we know that they are breeding and spawning in this area because Barb has tagged so many of them and observed their behavior by virtue of these tracks and how much time they're spending diving. And then when they are spawning and breeding, they have a very specific behavior of much shorter dives that are just the behavior that they're exhibiting when they're spawning. And that behavior actually shows up right in the region of the deep water horizon, the big black splotch there. Now, we were lucky in some regards when the spill occurred right at the worst possible time for bluefin tuna, but some of the eddies in the Gulf really cooperated and helped provide some safe harbor for the bluefin that were spawning. What we don't know is the fate of all those larvae that were released during that spawning, and I'll say a bit about that later. The Gulf of Mexico also contains the largest expanse of wetlands in the lower 48. It's an incredible area, and these wetlands are enormously important for so many different functions. They provide very important shoreline protection. They're the nursery grounds for many of the commercially valuable species in the Gulf of Mexico. And they are very important for the filtering of water as it's flowing into the Gulf. And as we all know, a lot of the water that's flowing into the Gulf from the Mississippi River is in need of some filtering. And 75% of the migratory birds who are flying up through the Gulf of Mexico up to Canada are actively using the Gulf's wetlands. It's very important for these species. Many of them are threatened, but it's staggering to understand just how many species are cooperatively using this same geography. The oyster beds are of particular concern in the Gulf of Mexico. They're, of course, one of the most important commercial species, and they too provide really, these oyster reefs are so unique. They of course form habitat in and of themselves, so they're very important for a number of other species who are using those reefs as their home. They're important just for their commercial value and their protein value. And they're super important for shoreline protection. And one of the concerns that has been voiced by many of the folks who have been looking at the cleanup efforts associated with this spill is the amount of freshwater intrusion that has occurred just by diverting a lot of the Mississippi River down through the wetlands and out into the Gulf of Mexico to sort of stave off the entry of the oiled water into the wetland areas. And extended period of time of freshwater intrusion into areas like oyster beds can actually kill them off. So there needn't have been any oil on these oyster beds necessarily to kill them off, and this is a grave concern to many of the organizations who have been dedicated to the restoration of the Gulf and ensuring the longevity of these oyster beds. Another species that we're really just beginning to scratch the surface of knowing a lot about are the deep sea corals that exist in the Gulf, many of which have been found in the immediate area of the Macondo well. Now, this is a super healthy coral. You can see there are all sorts of other critters living within and around it. There's a crab, there are some snails, there's a bunch of species whose names I probably could never pronounce, but it's obviously a thriving environment for these deep sea corals that are living at tremendous pressure and no light. I mean, it's just a crazy place for a coral to be, but very exciting to know that they exist in this area. So now that we've seen all the glory of the Gulf, or some of the glory of the Gulf, let's talk a bit about how it's been impacted by the spill. Well, probably the first thing that I should fess up about is that we all know that the Gulf is an already quite compromised ecosystem or complex of ecosystems. The oil rig on the left is from the 1950s, so oil's been no stranger to the Gulf of Mexico, and many spills associated with that, so we're all aware of that. There are a lot of natural seeps as well. But the introduction of nutrients into the Gulf of Mexico by virtue of the Mississippi River has been a major problem for the Gulf. And what's depicted on the right is the dead zone. The dead zone has gotten as big as, say, 7,000 square miles. And it's an area of the Gulf that's essentially deprived of oxygen, so it's very difficult for organisms to survive in that area. And it's certainly had major impacts on the commercial and recreational fisheries in the Gulf, and it's an area that organisms naturally avoid. The natural resources damage assessment, which is an obvious aftermath of this spill, is just beginning to tally up some of the observable impacts of the spill. And these are the bodies and carcasses that they've been able to count. Of course, if you talk to some of the scientists who know about many of the species that concern them, whether it's the dolphins or the turtles or the bluefin tuna or some of the other species, many of those animals will actually sink if they experience mortality after contact with oil. So they're not really expected to wash up. So we're really not very clear at all on just what the body count is, and that's quite important to keep in mind. And it's, even though there were sort of heroic efforts to save many of those turtle hatchlings, I know we all saw the pictures of Jane Lubchenco and others taking the turtles and bringing them around to the other side of Florida to cleaner beaches. It's really unclear whether those species that they were trying to save will really ever make it, because their own dead reckoning is really disrupted by, at least if you talk to turtle experts, they're concerned that they'll never really make it back. So these are the obvious impacts associated with the spill. But there are a lot of less obvious impacts, including the story of the bluefin tuna and the larvae. The crude oil that was spilled is considered a cardiotoxin, so If it comes in contact with a larval stage tuna, or for that matter, just about any larval stage fish, it is likely to kill that organism. And so it's not clear to us what will happen to this year's age class of the bluefin tuna that were spawned during the time of the spill. There have been some estimates that maybe 20% of the larvae experience mortality, but if you talk to Barb Block, she'll tell you that we really have no idea at this point. We do know that they were there. We know from some of the submersibles that were put down, they collected larvae, so we know they're in the area. I think time will only tell what the impact has been for the bluefin larvae or for other fisheries that were also spawning at about the same time. And the deep sea corals, we already know from some of the photographs that have been taken on the seafloor, have not fared well at all. And I'm not sure if any of you heard the NPR story this last weekend giving an account of the Alvin expedition, University of Georgia, taking a submersible down to the seafloor. They were finding that there's pretty extensive coverage of a thin film of oil on the seafloor. At least that was their observation. So we're quite concerned about this finding because we weren't sure if a lot of that oil which had been dispersed had been consumed by bacteria and just how much of it had versus how much actually had settled on the seafloor. But it's obvious from the image on the right that that coral is not healthy. There's a brittle star hugging it, I suppose. No, that's a very anthropomorphic thing to say, but it's clear to see the difference in color from the live coral and the dead coral. And I think the other thing that's really cool about the Gulf of Mexico is that, or for that matter, the global ocean, that the largest migration on Earth happens in our oceans, and it happens on a daily basis. There are huge numbers of species and populations and organisms that are going up and down the water column, chasing their prey. We've got the photosynthesizers that are rising up from the depths of the ocean, coming up to the photosynthetic zone during the day, and then dropping down to the lower depths in the evening. And then you have everybody who's chasing those phytoplankton and zooplankton, and the things that are eating those things that are chasing those plankton going up and down with them. So here you see, in terms of a cross-section of the Gulf, the relative depth of the spill itself. Just because we know that these animals are often found at certain depths, many of them are actively using the full water column and were likely traveling through the area of the spill. So the economic effects have been fairly grim, and here I need to consult my notes because there are some figures here that I'd like to share with you. The revenue at Gulf Coast hotels in Alabama and Florida dropped as much as 29% from their 2009 levels. It's estimated that the spill could cost the seafood industry in the Gulf about $172 million. That's really unclear, though. That's just a guess. About 2,000 people were directly involved in the offshore oil and gas industry, lost their jobs during the moratorium. And as of November 18th, BP has actually paid about $2.3 billion to individuals and businesses, and just over $1.3 billion to federal and state entities. But this is just the beginning of the tally. There was another story on NPR yesterday or the day before talking about the psychological toll of the Gulf spill and the effects on the human communities that really are connected with the Gulf of Mexico. And so, you know, this is a spill that's going to continue to reverberate through the coupled human ecological system that is the Gulf of Mexico. So now I'll get to the point that Mark thought I was going to really start off with, right? Which was, you know, how do we manage this industry anyways, and what's wrong with that process, or, you know, what are a few of the things that seem to be wrong with that process, and how can we do better? Well, there are two federal statutes that really guide the United States and formerly guided the Minerals Management Service, which is now the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, or BOEM. And those are the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. The Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act was actually adopted back in the 50s, but it actually underwent fairly significant changes for the Gulf of Mexico after the 1970s oil crisis. And it was in the late 70s that statute actually really embraced the acceleration of offshore oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and made some fairly significant changes to how the Minerals Management Service of the Department of Interior was to actually engage in environmental review and processing of permits and plans for the Gulf of Mexico, and I want to share those with you. The point I would like to make about the National Environmental Policy Act, which is a federal statute that dates back to about 1970, is that is a federal statute that requires the examination of major federal actions that could significantly impact the environment, the human environment, and the natural environment, and requires federal agencies to actually take a look at the environmental impacts associated with their actions, to examine mitigations that could address those impacts, and to consider alternatives to the proposed action that might actually reduce the impacts associated with the measures that they're about to take, or the permits that they're about to grant, or something that they're about to fund. But the National Environmental Policy Act does not actually require a federal agency to incorporate mitigation measures, to choose the least environmentally damaging alternative, or even one that's slightly less environmentally damaging. It's really just a procedural document. It requires federal agencies to just go through the process of understanding what the environmental impacts associated with the proposed action might be, and just to be more informed through that decision-making process. It also importantly allows the opportunity for members of the public and other agencies to get involved and offer their opinion, but by no means does it require the lead agency to actually pay attention to those comments or to make changes in their plans based on those comments. So that's important to make clear. In California, we have the California Environmental Quality Act, and it is more than a procedural statute. It's actually one that does require the adoption of certain mitigation measures, but that's not the topic for this evening. So this is a somewhat simplified graphic of the multiple stages that are involved in reviewing an offshore oil and gas exploration project. And I want to walk you through each of these stages very briefly, just highlighting a few of the things that I think are pretty noteworthy. But if you look at this just en masse, you can see in between many of these blocks, I've indicated what the comment periods are, or review periods are, between publishing a draft environmental impact statement and issuing a final one, for example, or when you're calling for information in stage 2, and then you're actually going to define what your sale area are. Each of these comment periods is really relatively short. So it doesn't provide the Minerals Management Service, or now the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, a long time to consider those comments and to take a different course of action. And that's really emblematic of the entire process. So they're moving fairly quickly through this process. And of course, that is in line with an overall desire to expedite oil and gas exploration and make sure that we meet the demands that Mark was talking about. But I'm going to take you stage by stage just to give you a slightly more nuanced view of the process. Now, in this first stage, we're looking at a 5-year program. So the federal agency is basically looking at the entire exclusive economic zone for the United States, and that's out to 200 miles from shoreline, and making a decision about which sections of that entire EEZ is going to be included in the 5-year program. So in order to get down to the point of actually selling a lease or engaging in exploration, you have to be included in the 5-year program. It's at this stage that the federal agency is undertaking the environmental impact statement preparation and review and comment. And of course, when you're dealing with an area that's as big as large sections of the Gulf, big sections of the Arctic and around Alaska and off the Atlantic, mid-Atlantic, when you're dealing with a collective area that is that huge, it's really, really hard to be very detailed in your environmental review. And of course, the agency knows that and says, no problem. We're going to develop a tiered approach to our environmental review. So at stage 1, we're going to have a very, very high level, 30,000, 50,000 foot look at environmental impacts. And as we go to successive stages, we'll get more and more detailed for you as we narrow in on specific geographies. At this stage with the 5-year program, the Minerals Management Service is obligated under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act to consult with states that might be included in the 5-year program and with the U.S. Attorney General just to take a hard look at whether there might be some important antitrust concerns. And they're required to respond to those concerns if they are voiced by the states or the AG. It's not required at this stage to consult with other federal agencies that, like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. EPA or NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But it is required to take a careful look at potential antitrust complications. Now in stage 2, this is where the rubber really hits the road because this is where the Minerals Management Service is looking at specific sales, and this is where they're poising themselves to actually sell leases. This is the moment at which investment-backed expectations are created in those who are purchasing the leases, and really it's sort of the point of no return in the process. Now for this stage, again, there's a draft EIS, you're going through a review period, but the nomenclature that is used here is a little bit misleading. They talk about planning for a specific sale, but their historic practices to actually bundle up a bunch of lease sales all at once and consider them collectively. So this was true in the Gulf of Mexico. They bundled up 11 lease sales and formed a multi-lease sale environmental impact statement. Ironically, while they tell us in the first stage that they're going to get even more specific at this stage in their environmental review, the environmental review documents, which I have looked at as carefully as I possibly can to try to find some careful examination of impacts. Ironically, the environmental review that takes place in this stage 2 is really about equally general as the stage 1 environmental review. So in contrast to this idea of tiering and getting more and more specific, it's staying at a very general level. Now in stage 3, this is the exploration stage, the point at which the Deepwater Horizon well actually blew. this is where the metal hits the road in terms of time, place, and manner of exploration. You're putting specific plans together for specific geographies. And there's an interesting thing that happens under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act for this stage 3. And that is, under the federal statute, exploration plans for the Gulf of Mexico get a categorical exclusion for environmental impact review. That means that no review is necessary. And then on stage 4, which of course we didn't get to with the Macondo well, that's when, if your exploration stage proves out and you do want to proceed with full development and production, then you have yet another set of reviews that are necessary: coastal zone management, where you're consulting with the states, et cetera, and further environmental review subsequent to that. But again, in the Gulf of Mexico, categorical exclusions are granted, and no detailed environmental review is afforded at this stage. So my point here is that we're really sort of have a sacrifice zone in the Gulf of Mexico for environmental review for offshore oil and gas exploration and development. And I mean, it was really sort of designed that way. That Congress saw that this was a very important place to exploit, and they've really accommodated that both through the statute itself, but also through the Minerals Management Service's interpretation of the statute and application of NEPA to their own practices. So I should not put all of the onus on Congress. I should also say that the Minerals Management Service, as it proceeded through this process, really took the shortest possible pathway when it comes to environmental review and when it had a choice. And I think that one way of comparing their approach to complying with NEPA would be to look at other bureaus within the Department of Interior, which is where the Minerals Management Service resides. If you look at the Bureau of Land Management, for example, that governs huge acreage across the United States, but in the terrestrial zone, they would never, ever think of covering the millions of acres that were covered by the multi-sale lease with one environmental impact statement. That simply isn't done. And if you go to the documentation and handbooks that are available for compliance with NEPA, you'll see that the Bureau of Land Management actually has really carefully crafted approaches to that. So the culture within the Bureau of Land Management, which is a sister bureau within the Department of Interior, is very different than the culture of the Minerals Management Service. So how can we improve the process? Well, let me just offer a few suggestions, and then we can go to the panel and questions. First, I think that in light of the fact that in 2009, President Obama actually issued an executive order announcing that we were going to have a national ocean policy in the United States. We've never had one until that EO came out. And that national ocean policy would be that we would approach our marine and coastal ecosystems with a sense of stewardship and with a responsibility of stewardship. That he understood that the coastal and marine ecosystems were very important for national defense, for public health, for vibrant coastal economies, but it was paramount that if we're going to continue to be these vibrant coastal economies and enjoy the public health that we do, that we have to sustain these important ecosystems. So if there were an umbrella of protection for these ecosystems that pervades our approach to application of these big federal statutes that allow us to go in and harvest fish and explore and develop for oil, then it would be my suggestion that we think about adding the protection and maintenance and restoration of the oceans to the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act as a companion mission and responsibility for the Department of Interior. Now, this is done all the time. We have many, many federal agencies that have multi-purpose statutes, and we're asking them to at once allow for some exploitation, but also be careful to sustain the resource over time. And it can be tricky business for a federal agency to actually carry out these at the same time, because often they will be in conflict. So there's another process that is called consultation that often is helpful where you have a multi-purpose statute. And consultation is a formal requirement that the lead agency, in this case MMS, actually go to its sister agencies in the federal system who have other expertise that is relevant to the lead agency's job. And in this case, it would be the US Coast Guard. In the case of spill response, for example, it would be the US Fish and Wildlife Service when it comes to potential impacts to endangered species and fisheries. It would be the US EPA when it comes to issues about water quality and even spill response and environmental justice, and so on and so forth. And there are many, many different forms of consultation that are readily used in our federal system, whether you're talking about the regulation of insecticides, for example, under FIFRA, or whether you're talking about the regulation of water quality under the Clean Water Act. We have many different flavors of consultation. They range from just having to reach out to those agencies and inviting them to provide comments and insights and suggestions for how to do a better job with respect to those resources that they know more about, or all the way down to actually requiring that you adopt their recommendations, and if you don't adopt them, you need to explain why and potentially go into mediation with those sister agencies. So I have about 10 different flavors of consultation that I could go over with you, but I think you get the point. Another suggestion that I would have is that we really have to take NEPA seriously, and I think it's disingenuous to use the categorical exclusion in the case of offshore oil and gas exploration and drilling. Categorical exclusions were initially developed by the Council on Environmental Quality, which oversees our federal system and our implementation of the National Environmental Policy Act. They were originally conceived just to deal with situations like financial transactions or administrative actions that couldn't possibly have any impact on the environment. So, you know, you don't have to go through the whole process of trying to figure out if you should do a full environmental impact statement. You can just apply a categorical exclusion to those situations. It's been vastly overused in our federal system, and the MMS has been no exception to that. And the Council on Environmental Quality has documented this overuse and has made strong suggestions that its use be curtailed in specific situations, including in many cases for the MMS. I think it might be my final or next to final suggestion is that we really need to think carefully about maybe a stage 0, and that is we need to take stock of the systems that we're going to be affecting and understand what's actually there. Often it's only when a crisis like this occurs that we start to explore the ecosystem and get a better idea of actually what was there and what got harmed, particularly through the natural resources damages assessment process. We've got, the trustee agencies looking really carefully at the Gulf ecosystem and questioning, how does this ecosystem actually function? What was actually at stake? What kinds of goods and services are we losing with spills of this nature? Those are all questions that I would suggest need to be asked up front so we do understand what the potential consequences and trade-offs are. The other thing that I think is pretty obvious is we need to do a much better job of oil spills response planning. The oil spill response planning in the case of the Macondo well is pretty much a joke. We've all heard about walruses being included in the spill response plan. It was a real cookie cutter boilerplate plan that evidently no one was really looking at very carefully. But we have great examples through our federal system of really conscientious accident response planning, whether it's the nuclear industry or the chemical industry. And I think we need to carefully examine, within our own family of agencies, how we do a much better job in other sectors. Another point that I think is key, and this is again going to sectors where you have those low probability, high consequence potential, like the nuclear industry, for example. They have really embraced the probabilistic risk assessment approach. They're looking at very complex coupled technological and human and natural systems. They're looking at the weak joints in those systems. They're looking at joint probabilities, where you can have a succession of events or decisions that collectively can lead to a really critical accident, and trying to fix those weaknesses in those systems and the weak links. So that's my layman's version of probabilistic risk assessment. I'm sure there are people here who know much more, but the idea is that we're doing this in other industrial sectors, and whether it's the safety approach that Mark is suggesting, and perhaps this is a version of that, I think it's important to take a page from those other sectors. And with that, I'm going to leave you.
We're going to open it for questions, but I want to start out with a few of my own, if you don't mind. And then if you have questions, you can line up on either side at the microphones. But, Meg, let me start with a question for you. This the MMS is now BOEM. So does that really make a difference? I mean, what are the changes? How does the agency operate? Does it operate differently? Is there evidence from other such renovations that kind of change really makes a difference in terms of outcomes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and not one that I really touched on other than alluding to the cultural problems. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management actually has gone through a restructuring since its former self as the MMS. This is something that Secretary Salazar did pretty quickly, I would say, after the BP disaster. One of the weird things about MMS is that it's a federal agency that actually collects the oil and gas revenues at the same time that it's issuing permits to folks to explore and develop oil and gas, at the same time that it's engaging in enforcement against those same entities for their failure to conform to the regulatory requirements, at the same time that it's supposed to be developing the scientific expertise to understand, the ecological systems at risk, the technical systems that are being deployed in the pursuit of oil and gas, and the list goes on. And so one of the things that Secretary Salazar did right away is separate the revenue collection side from the permitting side. That was a fundamental change. I think that there are many of us who look at the combined function of permitting and enforcement and the development of significant scientific expertise and question whether it might be very important to create a firewall between those three sections as well. And for many reasons, you're wanting to make sure that there's real independence and autonomy for your enforcement officials so that they don't feel constrained by the permitting staff and their interest in moving through the process. At the same time, you want to make sure that your scientific expertise is truly credible and independent. So whether you can successfully do that by joining it up with permitting and or enforcement is, I think, a really valid question.
Okay, great. Let me ask Mark a quick question. I think your report, your committee's interim report, referred to a lack of operational discipline as being a major issue here. Are there regulatory changes that are being discussed to address that issue?
The term lack of operational discipline actually captures a lot of what the committee came to believe surrounded the accident in this particular case. We're repeatedly asked, well, what does the Macondo well mean about, you know, drilling in the Gulf of Mexico in general? Can it ever be safe? And we know from, you know, the history of many successful projects, it's normally safe. But what happened in this particular project is that key decisions were being made. In a number of cases, they were ill-advised, and there wasn't an internal process by which those decisions were being evaluated by competent engineers who should know better, quite frankly. So, for example, before they started to unload the mud from the well as part of this process of temporary abandonment, they did a test to evaluate whether or not the cement was sealing the hydrocarbons. Roland talked about this in detail 2 weeks ago. That test failed 3 successive times. It was absolutely clear that that test failed. And yet the results from that test were never communicated to the engineers on shore. There was never anyone looking at it. The MMS at that time did not look at it. And it's sort of unconscionable that one can proceed and take the next step when so clearly the conditions required to take that step safely had not been met. And yet the decision was made on board the Deepwater Horizon. It was not communicated on shore. And we know the result of that activity. And when we look at a number of the other decisions in that long list, it also characterized many of those decisions as well. And whether it was sort of within the contractors to BP, within BP, or through the lack of appropriate interaction between the company and the regulators, that these things, the accident happened when it could have been caught through a vibrant and interactive regulatory system in which both parties had full knowledge of the critical data and had the ability to interpret what should be done.
Okay. Well, Roland, if that's the case, that there's an integrating an operational need for decision making, that, as Mark is saying, are there technological innovations that could also be expected to help the situation in the future to prevent something like that?
Yes, I believe that there are. I mentioned some of them 2 weeks ago, and I'll mention some again in a few moments. But you know, it's one thing to have a device which is put there for the safety of the environment and for the people on board, and it's another thing for it to be used and it to be inspected and be required to be used. It's like having a seatbelt law. Every car may have to have a seatbelt, but if you don't have a law that requires them to be buckled, then in fact they have no utility. So there are lots of safety devices which we could imagine adding, but there are already many, many devices, both physical devices and administrative devices that exist in deepwater offshore drilling that were not actually made to be used in the case of Deepwater Horizon. But if I mention some specifically, the blowout preventer is, you know, the big bugaboo. It's the bad guy in the story of the Deepwater Horizon. It could have not, although it wouldn't have saved the vessel and the 11 lives, it would have saved the spill had it functioned properly. The technology that's used in the blowout preventer of the Deepwater Horizon is barely different than blowout preventers for the last 50 years. And it's hard for me to imagine that we couldn't do that a great deal better. We can now steer drill bits at 20,000-foot depth to within a few meters of the desired location, and we can do it in real time. The information that could have been used in the Deepwater Horizon spill but was not available because the technology was not provided seems to me a manageable feat. For example, to have on-board indications of the complete status of the blowout preventer, which valves were working, which ones were not working, which electrical circuits were live, which ones were not functioning. it's also feasible to have a recognition of what fluids are inside of the blowout preventer. You know, if gas is passing the blowout preventer, it's a serious situation. Currently, the way that that's acknowledged is by pit level measurements. You know, a guy with a wooden stick in a large container of fluid. You know, hydrocarbon detection inside the blowout preventer should be an achievable technology. We should require that, and we should require it to be used.
Okay, so you need the regulations to go along with the technologies. Okay, very good. All right, let's turn to the audience. Yes, sir.
Okay, this question is for Mark, and I'm not even quite comfortable asking it. In the beginning, you framed in a larger way that the world population is going up, and that creates demand that we must meet. It seems to me, as soon as you assume that you have to meet that demand of the extrapolated curves, you're giving away the major leverage we have as a society to work on the larger problems by reducing demand. So whose urgency is that, and how do we get caught in this trap?
Well, I think if you look at the kinds of things that are happening here at Stanford, I think what you see is that the problem is of such global importance and of such global scale that you don't do any one thing. You know, it's a full court press. And, you know, we're working on issues of carbon sequestration. We're working on technologies for renewable energy, issues of land use and biofuels, optimization of hydrocarbon resources, fuel switching from one type of fossil fuel to another. You know, it's the energy system that runs the world that we're talking about. And so it just requires a wide range of things to be done simultaneously, and the collective result of all of it will hopefully enable us to produce twice as much energy with even less environmental impact than the current energy system. I think when I look at that EIA diagram, the business as usual, it's striking by the lack of imagination that it reflects. Okay, that's just propagating where we are into the future with a little bit of frosting on top. We have to consider it a challenge to do much better than what's represented in that. And there are, hundreds of people here on campus and thousands of people around the world trying to do that. It's a big problem.
A much more interesting challenge to try and live with less energy rather than building in that we're going to have to double the amount of energy.
That's an extremely important part. I tried to emphasize it. It's another. There's an Institute for Energy Efficiency here on campus, and a major range of things that are being done in exactly that arena. So it has to be a key component of that, to do more with less, absolutely.
I was happy to see the comparison between the kind of careful safety measures that are needed for managing nuclear power generation in comparison to what we need to do for deep-sea oil drilling. And one of the things that I see in common between these two approaches is that we need multiple safety features that have a lot of that are redundant, that have large safety margins of safety in them, and in a system like that, it's necessary to pay attention to all of them and keep them all safe, keep them all having large margins. And a couple of examples: this one and the 3 Mile Island incident both seem to fail because individual safety measures were allowed to not be maintained correctly, and people cut corners knowing that there were other things that would take up the slack if something went wrong. And when it got to the point where there were multiple things going wrong at the same time, because an individual economy.
Is there a question?
Well, the
Sorry.
question is, how do we change the economic incentives so that people bear down on all of these things? Because there are limits. I think there are limits to what we can do with enforcement.
Yeah, well, there's a lot packed in there, but there is an existing liability cap under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, and there's no question that there's a strong desire to get rid of that liability cap, so potentially that would provide even more economic incentive to engage in the kind of safe behavior and procedures that you're describing. But I also think that, it's really common in other sectors, whether it's highway building with the Federal Highway Administration, I made some notes, or with the nuclear industry, to have external, independent review of standards on a regular basis, and procedures and best practices. So, I kind of want to throw a question to Mark, if that's okay, in response to your comment, and that is, do you think that there's any hope of the National Academy of Engineering suggesting that there should be some kind of independent scientific and technical review committee on an ongoing basis that is available to the BOEM and the federal agencies who are most involved with offshore oil and gas drilling, to ensure that on an ongoing basis we are using best industry practices, that there's careful review of the technical approaches and devices that are used, and that appropriate standards are being deployed.
She wants her answer to be.
Well, I wouldn't disappoint you. The answer is obviously yes. And it's a very good question in a couple of ways. Traditionally, what industry has done is it's relied on best practices as developed by organizations like the API, the American Petroleum Institute. And their approach is kind of a retrospective approach to propose best practices on what's worked well in the past. It does not anticipate very well the new challenges that really, I talked about how deep these new discoveries were. They're also in 10,000 feet of water, not 5,000 feet of water. It's going to be very, very challenging. Now, Secretary Salazar has proposed a new research institute to function jointly between government and industry to take on some of these challenges. And if that is successful and that moves forward, that would be the beginning, be far more than an advisory group. And it's an interesting historical perspective that this safety case approach, which I referred to, had been recommended by one professional organization, the IADC, the International Association of Drilling Contractors, but resisted by another professional organization, the API, although rumor has it that they're coming around, because it's clear that what's missing in this sort of checklist to safety approach that we use now is there's no kind of system safety. Nobody's kind of looking at the whole thing that doesn't have this conflict of interest that the people on the rig do, where they're in charge of safety, but they're also in charge of schedule and budget. Now that's a tough position to be in when you're 38 days behind schedule and $50 million over budget, which was the case for the Macondo well at the time the accident happened. And so there's a whole range of ways of sort of getting out of the kind of box we're in right now.
Mark, I'd like to make another comment about the situation where you have a very low risk, very high consequence safety environment sort of works against doing things primarily on the basis of past experience, because you don't have that much experience with things happening.
Yeah, thank you. We should move on. I think we are almost out of time, so we'll take the three standing questioners, and then we'll call it quits. So just three. And so keep your answers brief so that everyone can go home. Go ahead.
Yes, the experience in the North Sea by British Petroleum and the Norwegians is very different than what we have in the Gulf Coast. Could either of you comment on the safety procedures used in foreign countries that are very different than the United States? The second question is, there's a wide variety in knowledge and difference of safety procedures by different companies. Exxon now is known as very safe. People like Shell are very, very rigorous about the procedures and separate out the safety people from the operating people. So there's a wide variation that even is known in the industry, and has enough of that knowledge been mined in respect to this spill?
Yeah, I'll respond to that. There are significant differences. For example, you mentioned the North Sea. You know, I often like to talk about the Norwegians because they do their whole oil industry different than anybody else. The Norwegians like their oil industry, but what they like a lot more is fish. So they're happy to have their oil industry successful as long as nothing happens to the fish. And they have regulations and procedures and people sequencing which is quite different than anybody else's. At the same time, Mark made a very important point too, that BP and Shell and Exxon and Transocean and Halliburton and all of those companies work everywhere. So they are subject to all of the Norwegian regulations and UK regulations and quite familiar with them. So I don't believe, you know, following the direction of your question, that there's any difficulty for those practices to be carried over from one place to another. And importantly, we shouldn't ignore or reinvent regulations when regulations elsewhere are seemingly successful. It's actually counterproductive if one set of rules applies in one place and one set of rules applies in another place, given that the vessels themselves can actually move from the North Sea to the Gulf Coast and to West Africa and move around. So we should learn from other countries and also strive not to be in conflict with a good regulation that's working in other places.
Great, thanks. Yes.
Okay, so my question is for Meg. During this accident, we saw some confusion about what agencies should be doing, which agencies should be doing what and when. So from your, from your experience going through the regulations, have you seen that the current regulations give a clear division and definition for liability on different parties?
Oh, for responsibility, for example, for spill cleanup and...
Well, I mean, whether, regarding the remediation of, after the accident or during the accident itself, who should be chipping in exactly when? Because we saw a lot of agencies, kind of working at the same time on conflicting things, even though it's beyond their own jurisdiction of operation, if you want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the U.S. Coast Guard is in charge of oil spill response, and when it's in the maritime environment. So, Admiral Thad Allen came to the fore after a period of time and was really front and center and clearly demonstrating that he was in command. But it did take some time for that to happen, and I think there was a fair amount of confusion initially, and also just a federal agency, MMS, who was completely caught off balance, didn't have the technical capacity to advise its sister agencies on what was going on and what to expect. So I think that in the immediate aftermath, BP was very much looked on to, supply a lot of the immediate answers about how to respond to this thing and what to do. And so, yes, I think that whole immediate response period has a lot to be desired. And there have been proposed bills in Congress to address just that problem that you identified and make it abundantly clear who's in charge. Great. Yes.
Okay. So the point of my question is twofold. Really, I'm trying to fix the problem, I guess, and address the issue, and take this crisis and turn it into an opportunity. So I fully believe that in this case, in order to address Mr. Horn's point about implementing change and positive change and using new technologies to actually better the situation, not so that it doesn't repeat itself again, is actually going to come through the court system. And I think that companies like BP, a worldwide corporation, get the signal when there's a large class action or a large contingency lawsuit filed, and plaintiffs, the little guy, the people on the, that have no resources actually prevail in court. I don't think change and new policy is going to come from Capitol Hill. I fundamentally believe, in this case, it definitely will come from our courts. So my question is, do you believe, considering the measures Obama has already taken to settle many of the cases that exist, will such a case arise to, I think, inspire justice and positive change in the area of environmental policy?
Maybe I'll start. A lot of our committee work was done by being in the audience at the official Marine Board of Inquiry held by the Coast Guard and BOEM jointly. And at these hearings, when a witness would answer the questions of those two groups, they would then ask the questions of all the attorneys representing the parties of interest. About a dozen, 15 different lawyers would get up and hammer these particular individuals. It was pretty tough on a lot of people. The reason for that is there are dozens and dozens of lawsuits now pending, and there are also a number of investigations going on. The Department of Justice is using those hearings to consider both criminal and civil penalties for individuals or companies that may have committed some wrongdoing. So this issue of ultimate liability and blame, our committee never touched it. We stayed away from it. We dealt with the facts of what happened because the courts and other entities are dealing with that. And so what you're asking for is already happening. It's out there, and it's going to. The standard joke on our committee was that there are students in law school today that will spend their careers arguing these cases, and that's what lawyers do.
I really don't have much to add to that, and I actually have personally tried to stay one step removed from the entire litigation scene because I'm so deeply involved in trying to develop credible and independent ideas about reform.
Okay, well, I know that there are other questions, but I think we had better say, first of all, thank you so much for the wonderful presentations. I know I learned a great deal, and I'm glad you were here too to do so as well. Thanks for coming.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.